Well, let's go ahead and settle in for some reflection. Land into your body and bring in breath. The style of meditation today is a little bit different, but yet we're going to facilitate much the same. And that is the concept of Swadyaya, often translated or transliterated to spell SV. Some will say SW, hence Swadi or Swadyaya, roughly translates to self-study. It comes essentially from the Bhagavad Gita as well as the Yoga Sutras, meaning Patanjali's 8-limbed path. It is the fourth niyama, or the way in which we maintain our own self-care to be in healthy community. In fact, it's said that in chapter 6, verse 20 of the Bhagavad Gita, now this is the translation of the Bhagavad Gita that I like. It's a much more readable version. So in our meditation, I'm going to read what Jack Hawley has translated from the Bhagavad Gita. But then I'm going to share a couple of other excerpts on what that means as a way to practice Swadyaya. You can journal, you can engage like I am. I've got books all over my desk today. That engaging in study is essentially twofold: reading the texts and then diving into our own experience with the concepts, with the intentions, and eventually perhaps even allowing ourselves to wander in, through, and around those ideas, peeling back the layers, as Stephen Cope says, to find clearer truth, more of our own self. That's self with a capital S. So, I think one of my key lessons in study, this comes from the academic world as well as the yoga world, is that we can't force learning, but we can avoid learning by not showing up. And so by allowing yourself to show up, to arrive, to land, to breathe into this moment, you are beginning the journey of Swadyaya, of study. When the mind becomes still and quiet, the self reveals itself. At the depths, one experiences the joy and peace of complete fulfillment. When the mind becomes still and quiet, the self reveals itself. At these depths, one experiences the joy and peace of complete fulfillment. As I am not a Sanskrit scholar, I rely on those who have done the research. This comes from a collaborative combination of Lisa Lowitz and Rima Datta. Rima is a Sanskrit expert. She studies it, and then Lisa is a poet. And so the two perspectives come together to define Swadyaya as self-observation, self-study. Be rigorous in looking at yourself. Practice introspection. Study the ancient texts and scriptures. Read philosophy to enrich your mind. And recite poetry to lighten your heart. Know yourself deeply and authentically so that you may fully know others. Assess your thoughts and actions. Change what you don't like. Relinquish what does not serve you or others well. Embrace what does. Embrace what does, what serves you, what supports you. Let's come back to the Bhagavad Gita. When the mind becomes still and quiet, the self reveals itself. At these depths, one experiences the joy and peace of complete fulfillment. So perhaps the question is not so much, am I enlightened, but have I done the work so that I can know more the stillness, the quiet, the self? When the mind becomes still and quiet, the self reveals itself. When the mind becomes still and quiet, the self reveals itself. When the mind becomes still and quiet, the self reveals itself. When the mind becomes still and quiet, the self reveals itself. Stephen Cope's book, Yoga and the Quest for the True Self, honors this concept of the Bhagavad Gita. In fact, he refers to the Bhagavad Gita as the source for this teaching and uses it in his own self-development, his own growth, as he says here, in the quest for the true self. This is the most revolutionary aspect of Krishna's teaching. Krishna being Arjuna's guide and embodiment of Krishna, the God. The enactment of our vocation in the world stands in the stream of love that flows from the divine self to the individual soul. The Gita's prescription is filled with heart and is colored by an emotional, poignant connection between the God and the man, between the divine and the human. Through love, Krishna teaches, we rise above the field of opposites, of action and inaction, of nature and spirit, of passion and dispassion, to find a synthesis of them all. At the end of the story, Arjuna has awakened to his true self. Destroyed is my delusion. Memory has been regained. By thy grace, O unfallen one, my doubts are gone. Thy bidding will I do, speaks Arjuna. Arjuna is now established in reality. We have our own journey in discovering the self. And in discovering the self, we find our own dharma, our own life's work. But the process is the journey, not finding the answers, not determining the whys or the hows or the whats. It's being in process. When the mind becomes still and quiet, the self reveals itself. When the mind becomes still and quiet, the self reveals itself. When the mind becomes still and quiet, the self reveals itself. Is this a remembering of truth? An accepting of what is real? Stephen Cope says that we balance this practice of creating a calm, abiding space in our body, in our breath, and in our mind, in order to peel back the layers of protection and armor, the costumes and personas that we've put on, perhaps as Brene Brown might say, in order to protect ourselves, but also to fit in. The self is at the core, the center, beneath all of that presentation. And it's been there since the beginning. Not only is it our unique spark, it is the spark that unites us. Hence, yoga is the journey to the self, through the self, as some would translate this verse of the Bhagavad Gita. When the mind becomes still and quiet, the self reveals itself. Notice your tolerance for silence, perhaps even your willingness to seek silence, whether it's by turning off background TV noise or music and allowing yourself to focus singularly on the thoughts of the mind, the emotions of the heart, the scripture, perhaps, of your reflection, your study. When the mind becomes still and quiet, the self reveals itself. When the mind becomes still and quiet, the self reveals itself. As we bring this meditation to a close, notice what you notice, feel what you feel. May you be well. May you breathe deeply and move freely, labor lovingly, and live vibrantly. Namaste.